Hey all, FilthyRobot here, doing another Darkest Dungeon 2 deep dive for the early access, this time talking about the Hellion. So let's, as always, get through the stats and skills, then move on to the specialties and the summary of the character, and talk about what I think of this character. So at 43 HP, that's kind of on the medium end, not the low end, but not the high end, and the problem with that is this character tends to want to be in the front ranks, and having medium HP in the front ranks is a bit of a liability by and large. That said, they have one of the two characters with unique mechanics in this game, which is every turn start. If they have less than 50% HP, they get 25% damage, and less than 25% HP, they get a second stack of that 25% damage. So if you're under 25%, you get 50% damage, which means that as their health goes down, they become a bigger source of damage, which can be useful for things like boss fights where getting those kills in matter. So it's an interesting mechanic, both having not a whole lot of HP, so it's harder to trigger those, and then also being incentivized a little bit to keep your HP low. So kind of a unique idea, like a glass cannon front ranker is kind of weird, but kind of cool. So I like the difference. The things that play differently are always fun for me as a streamer and as a gamer to play with. 4 speeds on the low end, but not super low. It's not 2 like the Leper or Man at Arms, but 4 is pretty low, so they often are not going early in the round. The resistance profile is the most generic resistance profile we've seen yet. 30% resist to all of the dots, 20% to stun, 20% to move, 20% to debuff, and then 30% to disease. So they're getting a hit with a fair chunk of the dots, almost all of the movement or stun effects or debuff effects, and a fair amount of the diseases, which means they are not a particularly resilient character from those stats. Which again plays into this weird like glass cannon frontliner build, which is a bit scary as a player because it doesn't allow you a lot of protection from high spikes in damage. Sometimes this character will die on you out of almost nowhere. All right, let's talk about the skills. First up is Wicked Hack, their auto attack, their generic attack. It's a very, very boring ability. It has no rider effects, no real amount of crit on it. The damage is pretty decent at 4 to 7. Upgrading to 6 to 8, it does upgrade the low end, which I appreciate. Its target acquisition is really bad. It only hits position 1, 2, and can only be cast from position 1, 2. It's a one-dimensional, fairly high damage per action auto attack, essentially. Kind of on the low end of flexibility and utility, but okay on damage. All right, moving on. Iron Swan, unique ability here. This is a position 1 only ability, same types of damage as Wicked Hack, but also can hit, or rather only hits position 4. It's kind of weird to think about it because imagine this ability was just on this ability. So imagine if this was a 1-2 that could hit 1, 2, or 4. And that's basically what you get, but it costs you 2 upgrade points and it costs you 2 slots on your bar. So I like it because what I like about Iron Swan is that there are some areas where rank 4 damage is really important. I'm thinking of the Tangle right now, where the drummers really need to be removed as soon as possible. And this is a very good skill for doing stuff like that. But there's also a lot of areas where this isn't particularly worth having on your bar. You already have something that's nearly as good as that, which is a little bit more flexible, and you don't need to do position 4 damage. So it's an interesting ability. I use it, but I don't always love using it. It's a pretty boring ability to use. It's just because it doesn't really do a lot of things. It's very one-dimensional what it does. All right, moving on, Barbaric Yawp. I don't like this ability. I haven't found a reason to use it. So what it does is it's position 1, 2. It's an AoE versus position 1, 2 on the opposing side. It applies a debuff, which is a speed and damage debuff to yourself called Exhausted. It's a stacking debuff. I think it's 33% damage. I can't remember the exact amount of speed. I want to say 3, but it might be 33% speed as well or something. So it slows you down and makes your damage over time go low. Get lower as well until you remove that debuff. The debuff is kind of unique too. I don't think it gets removed from token removal. It's not blue and it's not orange, or yellow or whatever that color is supposed to be. Gold, I guess. So it's not a negative or a positive token. So I'm pretty sure that means it only interacts with things that remove it explicitly. And it applies weakness, which is a fairly nice status effect to both frontliners on the opponent's side. Weakness is minus 50% damage. Only 1 stack of weakness, although the upgraded version is 2 stacks, which is a hell of a lot better. Because if you think about it, you get 1 round versus 2 rounds for that, and it's like 4 applications as opposed to 2, which is really, really powerful because of the AoE element of that. So it's a big upgrade. And if the target has a combo stack on it, it will stun them on the front too, which is a lot better too. Again, I think stun is a fairly good use of combo, but I don't think it's the best use. And it's hard to apply a lot of combo stacks. So it's pretty rare that you're going to get both front targets stunned with this, because it's rare that that you have the actions to apply that much combo without better payoffs than the point blank stun. I rarely use this ability. I don't think the remove stealth is particularly relevant, although we may find more stealth enemies as the game progresses. So I don't use this ability. I don't like it. Mostly because I don't think the cost of the debuff is worth the effect of this, although I think the effect is fairly reasonable. So if this ability was exactly the same but didn't apply exhaust, I would probably consider this a much better ability. All right, moving on. If it bleeds, this is interesting because the Hellion has a couple different builds. It has that front line, really wants to be rank 1 for things like Iron Swan, but it also has the kind of mid-rank position, which are a little bit safer for the Hellion. Hellion is squishy and not particularly good resist and not particularly great HP, but fairly good damage. Means it would really like to be in position 3 nuking, but it tends to live in like position 1-2 as opposed to position 2-3, although you can use If It Bleeds from position 3. It's not a very high damage attack. It applies a dot, but it's not a very big dot, and the upgraded version of the skill isn't that much better, as well as it does utilize combo in kind of the worst way, right? Which is it drains combos for an effect that is only situationally useful, and it will always remove the combo even if that effect is not particularly useful to you. So it's a flexible skill, but it's not a particularly high power skill. So it's safer, flexible, but kind of not great. So it's okay. I use it a lot, especially before the unlocks get going on Hellion. And we'll talk about unlocks. Unlocks are really important for the Hellion character progression as a whole. I think we'll get there in a minute. All right, toe-to-toe is a bit more interesting from my perspective. It's a bit scary too, because this is a taunt and an immobilize. So you move forward, taunt and immobilize, do a small amount of damage, which is good because the skills with no damage application at all are really weak right now, by and large, because there's so many protective status effects that if you have a skill like this that does 2 things that you're looking for, the reason why you cast this is the taunt and the movement, and the immobilize. If you're doing 3 things and potentially removing a status effect from an opponent, it's a lot more interesting. You can use this in any position except 4, and it's one of these skills that gets really different once you've upgraded it, because it starts as doing the things I've just described, and then the second version of it, the upgraded version of it, removes those exhaust tokens from you, which is a really important element of the Hellion. I really like this skill. I value Immobilize quite highly. It enables a lot of shuffling stuff from your other team that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. If you think about it, the way that shuffling effects work on your team, I'm saying shuffling, I don't mean that. I mean movement effects work on the team. Often movement is a cost of a skill. So you get a higher powered ability, but it moves you to a position where you can't use that ability regularly. Well, that's not true if you have Immobilize, because Immobilize essentially removes the rank from the existence. So if we move this character, if we use this ability in position 1 or 2 where it moves to position 1, we can essentially conceptualize the team as not having a rank 1 position anymore. So if you duelist advance in position 2, you stay in position 2. If you lunge from position 3, you just move to position 2, that kind of stuff. So it enables more uses of movement effects by not pushing those characters into position 1, essentially. So I think this is a super cool skill, really interesting, a lot of unique applications, changes a lot from mastery to not mastery, has some scary implications. You can use it to try to get the Hellion damage buffs because you're taunting and you're gonna get attacked, but the Hellion doesn't have defensive skills particularly. So those attacks are gonna be full damage attacks on the Hellion. So I like this. This is super interesting to me. I'm looking forward to playing with it more. I use it a lot in my runs. It's really flexible. It does neat things. I like it a lot. All right, moving on. Adrenaline Rush. This ability hasn't been super good for me. So it reads pretty good because what it is a self-heal, has both a long cooldown, so you can't use it regularly, and a limited number of uses. Generally, the way the skills are costed is that as they get more restrictive in when they can be applied, more restrictive in how often they can be applied, and more restrictive in the total number of uses in a fight, they tend to get more powerful. But I don't really feel like this skill follows that. It's very restrictive when you can use it, can't use it a lot of times, and can't use it regularly, but it's not that powerful. So it heals you for 20%, but again, you can't use this unless you're super low at under 33%. And this character doesn't have a lot of base HP. So under 33% is very low, within 1 or 2 shot range of most enemy attacks, right? Removes bleed, which is good. And then gives you on attack, future attacks are going to heal you, which is a nice recovery effect, and removes exhaust, which is powerful. Now, the upgraded version also removes the other dots. It's a bigger heal. But it still has the same restrictions, right? So for me, this ability isn't quite there. It's like borderline there, because it's sometimes okay. It sometimes could be really good, like versus I'm thinking like a boss fight in particular, where you've already used an exhaust ability to start, then you've taken some upfront damage, and then you get a decent sized heal, remove all those dots that are applied, get healing over time applied to your next 3 attacks. So maybe it's a little bit better there. And to be fair, the Hellion needs help on bosses. So maybe this is where this ability really is going to shine. I'm going to have to test this a bit more in those situations. But by and large, I would rather, instead of running Adrenaline Rush, I would rather run their other heal, which I'll talk about in a little bit later. We'll compare those when we get there. But at the moment, I'm not using this ability very often. It's too restrictive for what the abilities it gives me, even though the abilities it gives are pretty unique and pretty cool. All right. Moving on, Bleed Out. This is another one of his abilities that if the Hellion is in position 1, you get some benefit out of it. This is a high damage attack, not insanely high, but still fairly high, much better than the average attack damage. And it has a huge dot on it. So its long-term effect is a lot, right? Especially upgraded, you're looking at 18 damage from just the dot side, plus another 6 to 9. So you're looking at 24 to 27 damage up front, which is really a lot of damage for a single skill. Super limited where you can put it though, which is a bit of a problem. Again, this might be a boss skill for the Hellion. I think the Hellion is one of the characters that's going to transform the most from your room fights and I was going to call it corridor fights, but I guess they're road fights, road and room fights compared to boss fights, just because of how their abilities interact. And it's interesting. I mean, this does apply the exhausted debuff. It's a big nuke. It's a big dot, but it's really limited in its target acquisition. And I think the upgrade, again, is one of these upgrades that's not super good. Now, the upside of that upgrade, where it ignores bleed resist at the cost of needing to eat the combo stack for that, is that you cannot itemize, you can not have to itemize the Hellion for ignoring bleed resist. You don't have to get bleed application as a trinket on the Hellion, but you are eating combo, and if you're generating combo, you probably have better uses of it than minus bleed resist. So we'll see if this ability if it's a strong enough damaging ability in certain situations to overcome the costs of having it equipped, which seem quite extensive to me. I don't like Bloodlust at all. I think this is a win more ability on the Hellion, and it's really, really inefficient action economy wise. So think about it. If you're getting a 20% damage when the target's, if you gain yourself 20% damage and the target is bleeding, the number, but it costs you a full action, you've lost damage, not gained damage. So really when we're going to see Bloodlust Shine is when you can repeatedly attack a bleeding target. And yes, you get the rider effect of, it's probably really the way to look at this is the rider effect is the extra damage versus bleed, and the primary utility of the skill is removing the exhaustion stack. Now, the problem is there's just better ways to remove the exhaustion stack that don't require I waste my entire action doing something that I'm not that excited about, that is only a small amount of situational damage. And the upgrade isn't any better, really. It's only a very, very small amount of increased damage for still the same cost in terms of actions. I think this is probably the weakest ability on the Hellion. Now, what I do like about all these abilities for the Hellion is they're all super complicated, right? Thinking about the best way to min-max these abilities and the best comps and the best types of situations they fit into is complicated because the abilities are complicated. They have a lot of different things they're doing, which makes for me, for interested, repeated gameplay decisions where I'm going to be, it's not going to be an immediate solve for how to use the Hellion efficiently and how to maximize the Hellion's impact with these abilities. So I do like that about these abilities. There'll be things I can do in the future. So, all right, moving on. Oops. Breakthrough. This ability by itself starts pretty bad. It's a forward 1 ability that AoEs the front 3, but it AoEs them for a very small amount of damage, 1 to 2. It ignores guard, but ignoring guard is not a very valuable ability by and large, especially on an AoE. AoEs by default ignore guard if the guarder is in those positions. So this only really ignores guard if the person doing the guarding is in position 4. So this ability by itself is really bad. Now, the interesting thing is it's one of the few abilities that does damage on application that's also a 3-stack AoE. So where it might shine is there's 2 abilities in the game that apply riders to an attack. outside of trinkets, 2 character abilities. And that's the Runaway has an ability that makes attacks apply burn, and the Occultist has an ability that can make attacks apply burn, blight, and bleed. This ability gets a lot more exciting if you're doing a bunch of things at once, right? Because it also applies exhaust, which is a big debuff. So if you're knocked out of position and you have one of those rider effects, then this is a 3-position nuke that can drop up to 6, like up to 2 dots each on this, for a total of 6 dots applied to that. That starts to get a bunch more exciting. But the setup for that and the times you're going to be able to use that are really expensive. So this is an ability that starts really bad. I don't think upgrading this is pretty much ever worth it, by the way, because I don't think the upgrade does anything. If you're utilizing this ability for its impact with those rider effects, you don't really care about 1 average extra damage. You just care about any damage coming out of this. Now, maybe that's a little bit different if you're being weakness debuff, where your damage roll could potentially be 0, but you get the idea. By and large, this ability requires a lot of stuff to make it good, so probably isn't going to be used most of the time. But this is Darkest Dungeon 2. Darkest Dungeon 2, presumably what we're going to see for the course of runs is we're going to see a lot of varied situations where you're, prior to the fight, going to be adjusting your skill loadout to best deal with the threats you're facing. In which case, this might have some really powerful positions, even if those positions don't arise very often. So could be a cool ability. At the moment, it reads pretty weak, but it might be very strong situationally. All right, moving on. This ability is awesome. This ability is pretty much the thing that makes Adrenaline's where's Adrenaline? Next one. Makes Adrenaline so bad is because these abilities fight for what they're doing. So this ability is a heal, same activator. You have to be under 33%, much less of a cooldown. Doesn't give you a heal on each future attack, but does remove self-stress right off the bat at 2 points, removes horror, and additionally removes allied stress at 50% chance. The upgraded version makes the allied stress remove a guarantee, which makes this a recovery skill. That's something you're going to want to use at the end of the fight. And it does add exhaustion to the character, but the exhaustion being added to the character is a lot less relevant at the end of the fight. Exhaustion is cleared after each fight. So adding exhaustion at the end of a fight really isn't that big of a detriment. So this is a recovery heal, a self-stress recover, and an allied stress recover that you can use if you're pressured for health, or if the end of the fight is showing up and you want to just recover. For me, this totally counteracts Adrenaline Rush, except for boss fights. So the Hellion plays, and we're almost there, and I promise we'll go a little bit more in depth in this in just a second. So we'll move on from this, but this ability is super good, super good. All right, final ability of the Hellion. This ability is awesome. This ability is awesome, rather. It's super high damage, 8 to 14 starting, upgrades to 10 to 18, decent crit chance at 10 to 15% depending on upgrades, ignores block, which is pretty good, and ignores guard at level 2. It applies an exhaustion stack to the Hellion, and it can be used from position 1 or 2, and it's just a huge nuke. So this ability is amazing in every room in road fight ever, because it's a huge nuke. You can one-shot lots of things later on when the creatures get a little bit more tanky. It's not quite a one-shot, but it's still very powerful. And if you're removing one of the opponents for a exhaustion stack, that's kind of exactly what you want to do with exhaustion to begin with. Now, I think this is one of the things that makes the Hellion so interesting, though, is because I think they play entirely different versus high HP fights like boss fights versus low threat fights like trash fights, right? So I think you're going to do a lot of ability swapping on the Hellion, because exhaustion is worse versus boss fights. If you're only taking 3 actions in a fight, then if you generate that exhaustion right off the bat, it's not such a big deal. But if you're taking 10 actions in a fight, or 12 actions, or 15 actions, exhaustion gets more and more penalizing. So yes, there are ways to remove it, but the ways to remove it are fairly ineffectual. So the shorter the fight, the more powerful, the less negatively impactful exhaustion is as a debuff. So this character, when it goes into boss fights, is going to play entirely differently rather. You're going to need to have a different skill rotation and a different design. So I think, for example, things like Adrenaline Rush are going to be a lot more interesting in boss fights, and you're pretty much never going to use them outside of boss fights. But we'll see the character design. So I really like this character. I think this character for me is an A tier character. It starts off as like a B or C tier character. The basic unlocks for Hellion are quite bad. It gets much, much, much better when you have access to these two skills, Howling End and Raucous Revelry, which are the last two skills you get as storyline progression unlocks. So this character requires a bit of an investment. And you don't start with the Hellion. The Hellion does become available fairly rapidly at meta progression profile rank 3, but it's not immediately available. And this character is super complicated. Not only does it have a unique mechanic specific to it, a lot of skills that are situationally good and situationally bad. It also has this really interesting condition thing where you're incentivized to have low HP, and it plays in the front ranks despite having almost no survivability options outside of heals and not very good resist. So it's often going to be in a situation where it's low HP in the front ranks, goes to 0 HP, doesn't resist the dot. It can heal if it survives, but some of the times it just dies and loses you the run. So I think this character is going to be, not only is it strong for all the trash fights now, I think it's going to be a very fun character to play with, because the people who spend the time and effort thinking through how the character works and playing to its strengths are going to get a really high return from it. And the people who don't are going to find this to be a really fragile frontliner that costs them runs all the time. And I like that kind of character design. I like the character design where there's a bit more depth to it and a bit more thinking about how to make it work. So I like this character. I think its potential is really high. It's hard to use, and it takes a bit of unlocks to get going. But I give this an A rank for my ratings of this. Anyways, hope you enjoyed the conversation about the Hellion. If you did, please let me know in the comments, and I'll see you soon.